Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. I'm Farrah, and in today's video I'm going to be doing my March reading wrap-up. So during the month of March I ended up reading 6 books. Well, I attempted to read 6 books. 2 of them were nonfiction and the rest were fiction. I really only participated in one challenge this month, and that was middle grade March. I only got to 1 book in the middle grade genre. And then Historathon, which I did finish something for Historathon. So let's get started. The good news though is that I did end up reading a bunch of my own books. That was something that was really important to me, just to kind of get through all these books that I have on my shelves. So let's start with my least favorite and go up to my favorite. So real quickly, I'm going to talk about a book that I read, or I tried to read, called A Week in Winter by Maeve Binchy. And this is an author that is pretty well known and popular. However, I had never heard of her before and I've never read anything by her. But this is an Irish author, and the setting of the book takes place in Ireland. I ended up actually getting the audio version out of this at the library so I could try to see if I could get through it a little bit quicker. The audio narration was great. The narrator herself was Irish, or she was using an Irish accent. And it was just really charming. It started out really sweet, charming, and we're following this woman named Chicky who she kind of impulsively marries this American and runs off to the United States to live for a little while, but then her marriage falls apart, so she ends up coming back home to Ireland. And through a different series of circumstances, she acquires this hotel that she wants to turn into sort of like a bed and breakfast type of venue. And it talks about her kind of renovating it and the people that she is involved with throughout her stay. That part was great. Where it started to fall apart a bit for me was that we get into some multiple points of views. And as we're reading along, it kind of never circles back to sort of the original story that we're following with this woman named Chicky. And it lacked like any sort of character development for me. And when you're getting a new person's perspective, you're kind of going backwards in time and talking about the same things just from the other person's perspective. So I kind of lost track on where I was in the story. And once we get to the second part of the book, you're just following the guests that come to the hotel, and it never ever circles back around to our original characters. So I wanted to DNF this probably around the 20% mark, but there was something that kept me reading, Irish magic or what have you. But finally, probably about the midway point, I was like, it's just not a book for me, and I decided to lay it down, and this will be donated for someone else to try. The next book I got to in my reading this month was a book called Wild Hope: Stories for Lent from the Vanishing. And this is by Gayle Boss and illustrated by David Klein. And I picked this up during my birthday shopping trip. And what intrigued me a bit was that it was a story that mixed Lent in with environmental conservation, which I've never seen that before. Just as a little bit of background, I am a cradle Catholic. I grew up in a really large Catholic family on both sides, Irish Catholic. Both my parents were one of 10 siblings. I came out of the womb and one hand was with Jesus and the other was holding a rosary. So I grew up with Lent as part of a tradition that my family always celebrated or observed, not celebrated, observed. And I kind of fell away from that a little bit over the years, but this year I did decide to observe Lent a bit more and get into it and just do some devotional reading for that. So I found this book, and it was really interesting. It's hard for me to kind of figure out how it's tied into Lent, but basically each week you read about 5 different animals that are on the endangered species list. And it kind of talks about what happened to kind of make them endangered, kind of what environmentally humans have done to destroy their environment and basically make it difficult for them to survive. And it sort of talks about the suffering of these different animals. And in a way, I guess it's supposed to take you away from yourself and just think of others. But in this sense, you're thinking about the animals around us. So I really liked learning about each animal. And as you get closer to the end of Lent, you get a specific animal for the different holy weeks when we start the final week of Lent. So you get a different animal for Holy Thursday, Good Friday, and Easter Sunday. So I really enjoyed that sort of approach to Lent, but what I didn't really like was the writing. The writing for me was a little difficult to follow. It had a sentence structure that I fumbled over quite a bit. I mean, at first I didn't pay attention to it, but as I got into the different animals, I'm like, oh, it was like one of those experiences where I wasn't reading smoothly. It was like I was stumbling through the sentence from the way that she placed the words. So I don't know if it was just me. I just couldn't quite get on with the type of prose she decided to use for this. But the illustrations were amazing. And they were quick little sections that you read about. So I really did enjoy it. I would say I probably gave this about a 3.5. I wouldn't say it's not like spiritual or anything if you're looking for something like that, but it was a really interesting approach to, something to read during Lent. So I enjoyed that. Next, we have my first nonfiction, and this is called Memories Before and After the Sound of Music by Agathe Von Trapp. And this is a memoir of the oldest sister of the Von Trapp family, which of course is the family that the movie and the play, The Sound of Music, was inspired by. And I picked this up from a thrift store a couple years ago because I love The Sound of Music. It's one of my all-time favorite movies. We did the musical when I was in high school, and so it just has a lot of nostalgia and great memories for me. And I was just interested in kind of getting this behind-the-scenes look at the actual family that inspired this movie. So it was really nicely written. It's told in a first-person point of view, and it was written, I think she was in her 80s when she wrote this. So that alone is absolutely amazing. She also does her own little illustrations throughout the book. She is an artist herself. And I just found it to be really cozy, such a nice read, such an interesting look into her life. It takes place throughout the 1930s, kind of her experience growing up and all the different challenges they faced. I mean, they were a very wealthy family, so they did have a lot of opportunity. They lived in these beautiful homes, which she described and she talks about throughout the book, and kind of how they fell into music and how that took them out of Austria in a very dangerous time during World War II, and it brought them to America, and it talked about their touring. And then finally, towards the end, we get a little bit of behind the scenes with The Sound of Music. And what I really enjoyed about this was her focus on family and how much her dad really, really loved them and went out of his way to do things for them. And he was very unselfish and selfless. Quite different from how he's portrayed in the movie. He's kind of like this cold, authoritative type of figure. He wasn't like that at all in real life. And it was interesting to see how upset these kids were when the movie came out and kind of portrayed him like that. But, she did come to peace with it. She had a chance to meet the actress that played Liesl in the movie, the older daughter. And it was just really enjoyable. It was very simply written. I would say there wasn't anything extravagant about the writing. And again, English is not her first language, but she did such a great job. And I'm really glad I read this. Yeah, I enjoyed it. I would say if you're a Sound of Music fan, you might enjoy this. But I don't think, if you aren't, then I wouldn't necessarily pick this up. So I gave this 4 stars. I really liked it. Next, we have my middle grade pick for the month of March. I wish I had gotten to more. I just didn't have time. And I remember in my March TBR, I mentioned I had wanted to reread some of my daughter's graphic novels. And I started to reread one, and I got about a little way into it. And then I was like, you know what? I don't think I want to reread these because I had such a great time while I was reading them with her that I don't want to reread, which I could already tell it wasn't as great as the first time around. So I want to keep those memories as they were. And I just ended up donating most of those graphic novels without reading them. But, that's the truth of it all, right? So anyway, for this I picked up A Wrinkle in Time by Madeleine L'engle. So this book was written back in the 1960s, and I believe this was a challenged book. I'm not sure if it was ever banned officially, but it was challenged, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But it follows the story of this young girl named Meg. She's a young teenager, about 13 years old, and she has a younger brother named Charles Wallace, who's 5. Their father, who is a scientist, has gone missing. He's been missing for over a year, and nobody knows where he went. Nobody knows if he's ever going to come back. He just kind of vanished into thin air. So one day, this group of entities kind of comes and visits them, and they know where her father is, and they choose Meg and her brother and this neighbor friend, Calvin, this random kid that shows up, to be transported into these different dimensions and realms to try to find him. So the story talks about their adventures through these different worlds, how they eventually find their father, and kind of what happens along the way. What I really liked about this book was I loved the writing. I thought the writing was great. It was one of those stories that even though it was written back in the 60s, it felt timeless because she didn't add a lot of pop culture at the time, or even, she doesn't talk about the appliances that were used at the time, if that makes sense, or too many references to the present time that as you're reading it, it feels like it's happening now as well. And of course, I have seen the Disney adaptation, which came out a couple years ago. So the whole time I was reading it, I was kind of picturing that in my head. It's more of a present day story. But I do love that timeless aspect of it. I like that the theme of the book did focus a lot on love and being loving and love conquering darkness and evil. So I did notice there were quite a bit of Christian themes throughout this book. They popped up kind of obviously and not so obviously. So it had kind of a Chronicles of Narnia sort of Christian theme going on, which, is very evident in the Chronicles of Narnia novels. Now, I believe this was challenged or banned because there is one little section where they're talking about the light workers or the light warriors that came to defeat evil. And they talk about Jesus Christ in with the same group of people as like Gandhi, the Buddha, and other figures that were promoting peace. So I think that there were some Christians that got really upset that Jesus was kind of lowered down into this group of people. And so that may have been why it was banned. I really enjoyed the book. I do not think this should be banned at all. This is a great story, and I really wish I had read this when I was a young girl. I think I would have absolutely loved it. So I gave this 4 stars as well. Then we have my other nonfiction pick. This is called Eve, How the Female Body Drove 200 Million Years of Human Evolution by Cat Bohannon. This book I read for Historathon, and I really, really enjoyed this. First of all, the title and the cover is beautiful. And of course, it's referencing Eve. In the biblical stories, Eve, of course, was the first human that was created. And the way she formats the book is that she takes us back to all the original Eves that popped up with these particular feminine traits that distinguish us from men. So she brings us back to the original animal that they could trace back, mammal that could lactate, and then to give live birth and that kind of thing. And then it gets into more other features such as walking and the vocal differences between men and women. Breasts, of course, the uterus. And so this was absolutely fascinating, especially I would say the first half of the book. I was just so amazed and intrigued. I learned so much. And what I loved about this was the writing style, because it was written in a way that felt very much like you were sitting down having a conversation with her. So even though the things she's talking about were academic and scientific, she just really wrote it and talked about it in a way that was very easy to understand. She's had a ton of humor throughout the book. She would interchange words for like modern slang, the male, genitalia and gonads. She would use the word, and it just made me laugh. Like, I laughed so many times throughout this book. It was really fun. It was really interesting. I learned so much. And I think that if you're somebody that's interested in evolution and you've never taken this approach as far as focusing on the female body and how that kind of separated and what makes women's bodies so unique and wonderful. I mean, there's a part right in the beginning that talks about the distribution of adipose tissue and fat and how it is supposed to be centered around our thighs and our buttocks and our lower abdomens. I mean, that is a sign of health, and it just makes you feel good about your body and everything. So really, really love this. If I had any critiques, I would say that her sense of humor maybe did get a little bit too much in some parts. Like there's a section on chimp testicles that just went on and on and on, and kind of was just like, okay, we get it. So that the sense of humor might not be for everybody. And then the second one was that I noticed as she got into the later sections of the book where we're getting closer to modern day humans, and she did get into a lot of the evolutionary cognitive psychology of what was going on. And I did find that she brought in a lot of her political beliefs, I guess you could say. You get a clear sense of her political stance. You get a very clear sense of some presidents that she did not care for. You get a clear sense on where she stands on the issues of abortion and women's rights and everything. And I didn't disagree with what she was saying. I absolutely didn't disagree. It's just that I felt it was oddly placed in this book, and it, for me, changed the overall tone as I got towards the end, especially the final chapter. I thought it was interesting. It was an interesting discussion, and of course it's her choice to add that in. It's just not something that I was interested in digging deep into in a book about evolution. I was more interested in the biology than maybe the psychology parts of it. So I do think that if you're somebody that has more conservative views, that might be very off-putting for you. If you look on Goodreads and look at some of her one-star reviews, you can see people were just not happy with that. There was also a one-star review that from an evolutionary biologist that said that some of the things she was talking about were not accurate. So that kind of made me sad, because when you're an everyday person reading this, you are kind of hoping that what she's saying is true, but maybe not all of it was quite as accurate as it could be. But it was a great book. I really enjoyed it. I listened to this on audio, and she narrates it, and she did a phenomenal job. So this is a book I'm definitely going to be rereading at some point, and kind of just going through it slower and tabbing what I found interesting. So yeah, I really enjoyed this. Okay, and the final book I read, my 5-star pick, my favorite book of the month, was called The Mountains Sing by Nguyen, Phan, Ma. This book was so good. It was so good. A full 5 stars. It was a perfect book for me personally. So this is a historical fiction set in Vietnam. 2 timelines. We're focusing on this one family. The main characters in the story are this older woman and her granddaughter. And the first part of the book starts in the 1970s. It's the end of the Vietnam War, and we're kind of seeing the aftermath, and we're seeing the effects of the war on the people of Vietnam, and the ongoing effects. It's not over yet. It's not perfect. Then we flash back in time to the 1930s when the grandmother is a younger woman, and we see her perspective from the time of the Great Land Reform. Was probably the major thing going on at that time. I'm not really going to talk about the plot too much. What I loved so much about the book was the beautiful, beautiful writing. I absolutely loved the way this book was written. This book was, I think, her first novel she wrote in English, and it was amazing. It was amazing. It was so beautiful. So the prose was fantastic. This was an instance where I felt the dual timeline worked really, really well. But it just focuses on the intense amount of love between this family and the strength of this grandmother and what she went through as a mother and how she kept her children safe. And it was so good. I really loved the grandmother's story, first and foremost. Then when we're flashing forward, she's trying to get her children all back together again from this war. And as somebody that comes from a big family, not only my own family with my siblings, but my huge extended family, I just really enjoyed that. I loved the love between the siblings. I loved some of the conflicts that came up between the relationships of the mother and daughter and the grandmother and her children. It was very realistic. It was beautifully told. There were a lot of difficult things that happened in this book, but I felt that the hard, difficult, horrible things that happened were so beautifully balanced with the kindness of people. So it wasn't like this bleak, dismal book where it's just like tragedy after tragedy. It would be like tragedy, and then you see the absolute kindness of strangers, back and forth. So it was so good. I really, really enjoyed this. If you like historical fiction and you enjoy reading about stories from different cultures, I highly recommend this book. So that was my wrap up for March. It was a pretty good reading month. I got through a lot. That I owned, and I ended up with some really great reads. So thank you guys very much for watching. I really appreciate it. I hope you guys read some nice things in March as well, and I hope April's going well as well. Now that we're in April, I feel a lot better. My energy's back up. The grass is green outside. The flowers are coming up. So we're getting there. But thanks again for watching, guys. I really appreciate it, and take care. I'll see you in my next video.